The Taoiseach says rural crime is nothing new, and it's the level of sophistication of criminals these days that makes policing very difficult, resulting in the violent crimes that have haunted rural Ireland. He has creatively profiled these sophisticated criminals as 21st century thieves, wearing night vision goggles, driving at excessive speeds down our motorways whilst high in drugs. He has used this criminal profile to justify the implementation of what he terms as 21st century policing. But it's his own notion of 21st century policing that has left rural Ireland vulnerable to these types of criminals in the first place. The government is conveniently blaming the sophistication of these criminals and not the government's own failures for the violent attacks that have put fear into the heart of rural Ireland. The real issue here is not that the criminals are becoming more sophisticated, it's that the centralisation of Ireland's police force has not worked in tackling violent crime since the government first implemented these policies in 2011. The policy was simple: take away community policing, close down rural Garda stations, and use those savings to pool the resources into a centralised police force. As a result, mobile criminals have exploited the policing vacuum created from continuous Garda station closures. But worse still, they were not getting caught, profiled and tracked, which those policies sought to achieve in the first place. Community policing was replaced with a Garda district and station rationalisation programme. It was announced in 2011 by Minister Shatter and represented the biggest restructuring in the history of An Garda Síochána. The programme's aim was to centralise policing resources in order to facilitate the introduction of enhanced patrolling systems, becoming operational and intelligence-led. Part of its policy was the closure of 139 Garda stations across the country, which has unfairly and disproportionately impacted on rural Ireland. The anomaly of all of this is the government's justification for these closures, where they say they have created 61,000 more man-hours for frontline services. And the government believes that 61,000 man-hours is worth more than local Garda presence in rural Ireland. But the fact is that 61,000 hours only equates to an extra 30 Gardaí right across the country when you take the annual hours that they would serve. All the while, the state has only saved €556,000 and continues to implement cutbacks in Garda resources. In Donegal, this has amounted to only €25,000 in savings from the closure of 5 rural Garda stations across the county. The costs of providing alternative services from other Garda stations have not been factored into the station closures, and these Gardaí have to travel further out to assist a member of the public as a result. Centralisation is not working, and rural Ireland has not seen the benefits of enhanced patrolling systems or intelligence-led operations. The government has justified the closure of stations, saying it would mean a more efficient and effective deployment of resources in the area of policing, and the opposite has been the case: more vulnerable towns and people and more cutbacks to Garda resources across the country. But not to worry, the government is aware of all this and has reflected the awareness of the recent capital plan. They have allocated €46 million for new Garda vehicles, €18 million for refurbishment of Garda stations, €700,000 to upgrade Garda cars, and €205 million for Garda technology systems. What is clear from these investment measures in the capital plan is that centralisation is still the dominant on the agenda, while local policing is a thing of the past. The public can be sure that this will continue in the next term if this government are re-elected. The new Garda cars, new upgrades and technology systems will do nothing to bolster community policing in rural Ireland. Rural Ireland needs an increased presence of local Gardaí. We need more resident community Garda personnel who have intimate knowledge of their localities and are aware of the at-risk offenders in their areas. The lack of local Gardaí has not just led to an increase in rural crime, but also to the perception of crime and the vulnerability of our communities. As crime is carried out, people feel they are not adequately protected, which could lead to notions of vigilante justice and people taking the law into their own hands, something that we've seen recently mentioned in the media. To further add to this scenario, rural communities have been shrinking due to the mass emigration of young people, job losses and threats of closure to post offices and closures of Garda stations. It has resulted in an ageing demographic that is more susceptible to burglaries in their homes. The shrinking of rural communities has led to increased geographical isolation of dwellings and less knowledge of the local areas due to the closure of post offices and Garda stations. I have another concern with the introduction of this bill: consecutive custodial sentencing. Who are these burglars, and to what extent will the consecutive custodial sentencing act as a deterrent to this kind of crime? The idea that consecutive sentencing will deter people from carrying out a similar crime and reduce recidivism rates is questionable, and international best practice is increasingly gaining insight to this outdated notion. In fact, if you look at the CSO figures, they suggest a huge discrepancy in the numbers of those who reoffend after a custodial sentence versus those who receive probation or community service. Upon close inspection of the CSO figures, recidivism rates were lower for offenders who committed burglary if they received probation or community service, 49%, as opposed to those who received a custodial sentence, 60% recidivism rate. The CSO figures also show that 28% of burglars who had served a custodial sentence and who reoffended committed a subsequent burglary offence, as opposed to 10.7% of those who had received probation or community service. Interestingly, the majority of these reoffending burglars were aged between 24 or under. The punitive approach to sentencing has led to an increase in prison numbers while recidivism rates remain high. Rather than looking at why recidivism rates are high and the contribution custodial sentencing is having to repeat offences in the country, the government wants to make it harder for repeat offenders to receive bail, thus meaning they will stay in prison longer, and then continuing the cycle of recidivism then when they come back out again, really proving the adage that the prison is the university of crime. Furthermore, according to figures from the Irish Prison Service, in 2014 the average annual cost of an available staffed prison space was €68,959. This figure represented an increase of €3,417 in the previous year. How much will it cost to imprison someone without bail for consecutive sentences? And would it not be far more cost effective to use community service and use probation and actually seeing that the figures for recidivism are reduced because of the use of those measures? That brings me to the most ironic aspect of the bill. Due to a reduction of the Garda services in rural Ireland, there has been an increase in burglaries. This will increase sentencing for those criminals, which in turn will require more enforcement of the law and in turn more Garda resources. So there's a virtuous cycle there of more crime, more Garda resources required. The real deterrent should be more Garda presence in 21st and if 21st century policing means less of that, then I think I would prefer, and rural Ireland would prefer, that we stick with 20th century policing instead.